Okay, so once that inspection had taken place, I had changed my view about what was going on. I had shared the view of managers in the school that Perth and Kinross Council had a strategy to cause reputational damage to the school and to force it towards closure. When those inspections took place and when I was fully appraised of what happened in terms of the registrar and the pressure that was coming through from Scottish Government, I developed the impression that it was much wider than just Perth and Kinross Council, that this was part of a bigger strategy, because it didn't seem rational or proportional in terms of the way the school was performing. The school was a good school. There were gaps, there were weaknesses, and I think we were fully aware of what those were and what needed to be done. But this seemed to be very much a vindictive approach that had been taken by the regulators. So I sensed a huge vulnerability. In fact, I came to the conclusion that the school and the Board of Governors were not robust enough to survive, and we needed to become part of a much bigger group. So it wasn't just politics, it was also in terms of financial resources, it was in terms of external management, processes that needed to take place. So I approached with a select group. I'd already mentioned to the Board of Governors at a meeting that I thought it was a wise thing to do, given the financial position that we were in. Initially they said no, don't do it. But when I looked at the timescales involved, I believe that if I didn't make that approach quickly, then we'd run out of time. So I went behind the backs of the Board of Governors, approached the Witherslack group, was quite impressed. In fact, I was very impressed by them. They insisted that they were very ethically driven. They didn't take money out of schools. They built the value of the group by acquiring assets like the new school and developing them so that they themselves acquired a value, and that was what the return to the investors would be. So I like that model, because anything we did within the school, any revenue that we generated within the school would stay within the school. Plus, they would invest very heavily in the built environment. So we had initial meetings with them in May. They came up to the school over the summer. They were very, very enthusiastic. This was going to be their headquarters in Scotland. They wanted to develop provision within Scotland, and they saw the new school as being their base. They demanded that I stay on, even though that had not been part of my plans, and I had to agree to that. They wanted me to move out of the role as head of school to become more a regional manager, which didn't appeal to me, but I had to accept just for the sake of continuity for the school. And it seemed to be going very well until around about September 2018.
What happened then?
In September, my contact with the Witherslack became, they were involved in looking at our policies and procedures, developing a management information system, shifting our data over to their data. There was quite a lot of training going on, liaison, particularly in terms of education and in terms of care. Less so for myself, but more at an operational level. And then for me, it started to go quite quiet, and my emails weren't being answered. And I just got a suspicion that they were dragging their feet. Having signed an agreement in August to take over the school in January, and having the main management responsibility for the school in that interim period, I was getting less and less communication from them. And I was also left in this very confusing position, not knowing who my boss was, not knowing whether I was answerable to the Board of Governors or to the Witherslack group, there being no protocol, nothing written down about who was responsible for what. So there was that, and then there was the huge workload of transitioning from the one organisation to another, and it was a tricky time, but we still felt that things were heading in the right direction. Then towards the end of September, I was just carrying out an ordinary process. It was a discipline process against a member of staff, and someone who probably was the weakest member of what was a very, very good team. That person was at the end of a disciplinary process. That person had appealed a final decision that had been made, and that person sent a note to me which raised concerns about other members of staff and their working practices. it wasn't at the time seen as very significant, because very often if you're disciplining a member of staff, what they will do is try to deflect criticism onto someone else, and it's just a normal thing that happens. So Angie and I read the note, read it very much for what it was, which was raising a concern about the working practices of other members of staff, and the fact that any physical contact between a member of staff and pupils could be misconstrued by others. And that was the phrase that was used, could be misconstrued, and could therefore become a problem. We intended to address that. It's not something we could just leave, but the note came through, or permission came through to proceed with investigating that and disclosing information 3 days before the start of the October break. So we didn't have time to deal with it at the time. In the meantime, that member of staff put the concern into the care inspectorate. And this time she named the members of staff concerned, whereas we in school didn't know who she was referring to. The anonymous note that was sent to the care inspectorate named the members of staff. And when we came back from the October break, the care inspectorate decided that this was a child protection matter, not about working practice. They insisted that the local child protection team were involved, and suddenly everything started to snowball. I had a conversation with the Slack group as things were unfolding, and the director who spoke to me said, "We are very, very scared." And they're scared of the actions being taken by the care inspectorate. The local child protection team acted very swiftly and very professionally. They interviewed the member of staff concerned, who confirmed immediately that she wasn't raising child protection issues, that she was referring to the working practices of the other members of staff. In other words, confirming that the way we'd interpreted the letter was correct. The police interviewed 2 pupils who were named in the note of concern. And at the end of the process, they came to the conclusion that it wasn't a child protection matter, that there were, quote, no allegations being made, that the pupils concerned couldn't recall any incidents that concerned them, that they were very happy, that they liked the members of staff concerned. And also, the investigating officer said how impressed he'd been with the new school staff who'd been involved in the investigation. So at that point, we thought that was it, the whole problem was over. I phoned Slack that evening, really to give them what I thought was good news, to be told that actually it wasn't good news. The care inspectorate were not happy with the investigation, that they wanted an internal independent investigation, that the members of staff had to stay suspended, despite the investigating officer calling me on the Friday so that I could reinstate the members of staff for the Monday. The care inspectorate said no, that couldn't happen. And they stated that we had to produce convincing evidence that the events mentioned in the note had not happened. And when I quizzed the care inspectorate to say, well, how would you do that? How would you prove a negative? I just didn't get an answer. She said, you'll have to speak to your chairman of governors about that. So then this whole process was dragged out. These 2 vital members of staff couldn't be in school, and that had a big impact on pupils. 3 days later, I was approached. I should also add at this point that I had said, because I sensed that Slack were now really concerned about the behaviour of the care inspectorate and the pressure the school was under, I had said that if it makes things easier, I will step aside. And Angie, we will step aside from our roles in order that Slack can put their own people in so that the whole takeover could go ahead as planned. But I was approached by Chairman of Board of Governors and one of the other governors on the Wednesday following that first conversation. And I expected them to say, yes, can you please step aside? But what they said is you're suspended from your work, which in principle I couldn't object to, having just myself suspended 2 members of staff. I couldn't object to the principle of it, but at the time I knew it was a tactical suspension.
Why were you suspended? What reasons were given?
I'm still not clear, really. I think it was that although the police investigation had demonstrated that the note of concern from the member of staff was correctly interpreted, correctly read, the carer inspectorate was saying I'd failed to pass on a child protection issue. So there's a fundamental contradiction between what the investigating officer had concluded and what the care inspectorate were wanting to conclude from the note that they had received. So, I mean, it would be serious if it was cut and dried, if there was a serious child protection matter and the head of a school had concealed that or in some way tried to or not reported it, then that would be serious. And yes, he would need to be investigated. But we'd already had an investigation which has demonstrated that was not the case.
Who do you think it was who took the decision to suspend you? Was this decision taken independently by the Board of Governors?
Well, I think it had to be taken by the Board of Governors, but it came from Alison Jameson within the care inspectorate, who had effectively informed them that I should be suspended. My understanding at the time was not simply that I was suspended, but this was being done for a particular reason to get me out of the way. And when I didn't see the enforcement notice or the improvement notice that came through on the Thursday, the day after I was suspended. When I read that, I could see why I'd been taken out of the picture, because there was no justification for that improvement notice whatsoever.
And you would have challenged it?
I would have challenged it. I would have immediately demanded an explanation as to why, for example, we had to ensure there were no conflicts of interest within the school when there had been no conflict of interest to justify an improvement notice being made. The improvement notice referred, we had to ensure that pupils didn't, there was no inappropriate behaviour between staff and pupils. But the investigation had already demonstrated that. So again, there was no justification. In fact, the whole improvement notice was, in my view, incompetent and therefore should have been immediately challenged, if necessary, by taking legal action against the care inspector.
Why did the board not challenge it?
I don't know.
The board appeared to take the official line with parents and staff that we have a quote from Andrew Cuby, the chairman, who said to parents, allegations of this kind can't simply be swept under the carpet. In my opinion, the involvement of the regulators is a self-inflicted wound on the school. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, well, let's go back to what was concluded by the investigating officer, the detective superintendent, who was charged with investigating this letter of concern. And his conclusion, having spoken to the member of staff who raised the concern, was there were no child protection issues, there were no allegations. The member of staff was simply referring to the working practices of others, and therefore that there was no attempt by the senior management in the school to not report or fail to pass on a child protection incident because there was no child protection matter to be discussed. So it's difficult to understand why the impression has been given that there were serious child protection concerns within the school when there were none.
I'm going to talk a little bit more about your the communications with the board. Mm-hmm. But first of all, could you talk about just the withdrawal of Witherslack, and that really, and the withdrawal of Witherslack, and then that final week.
Yep. So, as I said, my suspension took place the day before the improvement notice was issued. I could do nothing about it. I wasn't allowed to communicate with the school. I was receiving information from the school about what was happening. And I remember emailing Angie on the Thursday evening, they're going to close the school. I think they're going to close the school. Now, there was a board meeting on the Friday at which the board was going to take the decision to close the school at the end of term. But what happened on the following Monday was that another meeting was held, and it's my understanding, because that that's how I was informed by the Board of Governors, that at the time the care inspector insisted that the school close within a week, and that they took the decision on that Monday, I think the 19th, Monday the 19th of November, that the school would close by the end of the week. I was not part of the process. That's the point at which I felt most frustrated and aggrieved. I couldn't speak to staff. I couldn't in any way influence what was happening within the school. I didn't like the way the whole shutdown was managed, the rush to tell parents, failing to tell parents so that parents find out from their own children that the school is closing, the lack of planning and preparation and thought for kids with autism, very high levels of anxiety. It just struck me that in management terms alone, not even from a sort of humanitarian point of view, but in terms of the way you manage situations, it was done very, very badly. And but I was in the background and there was nothing I could do about it.
You had some, I mean, staff were forbidden from contacting you, right? But some still did so because it was a very traumatic time. And what were they reporting to you?
I wasn't getting a lot. I think staff were torn. They were also very busy, incredibly busy. It was extreme. The last week sounds like it was emotionally very draining. There was a lot that had to be done. I didn't want to put staff in the position of them feeling that they had to confide in me. One or two did. I just got phrases through like, "It's been a horrible day." I got the impression that staff were traumatized by what was happening and the way things were happening. That I wanted to be up at school, and I toyed with the idea of going up to school, but I was suspended, so I could have been sacked immediately if I'd done that. I just had to wait, had to bide my time.
Why? I mean, the staff reported that on the Tuesday, a whole group of multi-agency professionals, as they were called, came to the school and set up in the science lab, and that it was them giving instructions to the acting head of school, the Witherslack acting head of school. It was them giving instructions to him that he then passed on to management to action. Why would that have happened? Why suddenly were the remaining staff at the school not in charge, and why did it appear that not even Witherslack were in charge? Why did it appear the vast majority of the professionals there were from Perthing and Ross, and it's not a local authority school? What happened?
It's a difficult question to answer because it's a classic situation of a lack of clarity, a lack of planning, a lack of clarity, lack of accountability. Trying to find out, if we look at it in retrospect now, if we do a post-mortem on that last week, what I suspect will happen is a general acknowledgement that the whole thing was very unsatisfactory, but everyone pointing the finger at each other. And so Witherslack was saying they'll be caught in the middle between the authority and the regulators. The regulators will be saying that we were just advising, we weren't managing the school, that it was really the school or Witherslack. That's just what's likely to happen, but certainly the managers in the school didn't really have the final say on what was happening, and were being overruled on decisions and planning that was taking place. As I say, I've only got the staff accounts and what I've had in conversation from trusted members of staff, but it just sounds like a classic situation where there were too many chiefs and not enough Indians in the whole process.
Why were they invited onto the school in the first place?
Again, I don't fully know the answer to that. The part of the rationale, I believe, was that because there wasn't a head teacher, because there wasn't a head of school within the school, then there needed to be some other form of management support put in place. And given that at the time, the impression had been given by some that the school was an unsafe place, despite the fact the child protection investigation had concluded that no wrongdoing had taken place. There was I think, misinformation put out that the school was unsafe, that kids needed to be removed immediately, and possibly a deliberate attempt to create a sense of crisis so that the school could be closed down very quickly, and that it could be justified by the fact that there were issues around pupil safety.
Can you talk about the Witherslack involvement in that thing? So you've got the two reports, yeah?
There was, Care Inspectorate had insisted on an independent internal investigation following the external investigation that had concluded that there had been no wrongdoing. The Board of Governors decided to use Witherslack, who were already involved in the school, but I had warned them at the time that I felt that Witherslack were wanting to withdraw and that they could use safeguarding as the reason for that withdrawal, rather than for any other reason. And of course, what they have to, the directors of Witherslack have to go back to their investors and say why they've pulled out of a place, and to use safeguarding makes it easy. Rather than saying they've looked at Scotland, they now understand the aggression and hostility of the Care Inspectorate and Perth and Kinross Council, and that it wouldn't be wise for them to invest in the new school. Rather than saying that, it's much easier to say, oh, there are safeguarding issues. So despite my warnings, the Board of Governors went with Witherslack producing a report, and there was one report was into by the head of safeguarding into the various members of staff implicated in the child protection concern that had been raised. But a more general safeguarding report was written by Howard Tennant of Witherslack. And that was produced at the board meeting on the Friday before the Monday closure announcement. I wasn't allowed to see that report. Angie was not allowed to see it until just the evening before, so there was no time to do a response. But that report, which was inaccurate, highly distorted, defamatory towards the staff of the school, that was submitted to the board meeting, and decisions were taken based on that report, which again, in retrospect, I think a lot of people would now regret. But the report was also shared with the Care Inspectorate, with Education Scotland, and with Perth and Kinross Council.
Who shared it with Perth and Kinross Council?
Well, it must have been the Board of Governors who made that decision.
Why would they possibly have done that?
I can't comment. So I think my concern at the moment is primarily that there should be some form of investigation into what has happened, because there is a lot of misinformation, there's a lot of confusion. From my perspective and from my understanding, this is the first time in Scotland, and possibly the UK, that a school has been closed down on the basis of something that didn't happen. And when I've looked at other cases, where there have been inquiries, for example, Keele, or where you would have evidence of abuse of young people, very poor practice, admittedly some good practice at the same time, but where you have an establishment that doesn't have strong leadership, where there aren't strong management practices, where there isn't the positive culture and ethos that we had at the new school, you can understand why quite radical decisions were taken to close a service. But in this case, there were no real concerns. When you look at the child welfare incidents since January of this year, and I did an audit quite recently to just try and get some evidence and facts behind all the misinformation. Since January, within the school, there have been no incidents of pupil assaults on staff, no incidents of theft, no evidence of graffiti, no evidence of damage to property, no absconding. When you look through all the data, you realise that the school was a very benign place and a very happy and safe place. So for it to be closed down on the grounds of child safety begs the question of the regulators: where is the evidence for that? And how did all of this happen? How can you destroy what was such a precious, valuable community, which can never be resurrected? How can you cause so much human misery not just to the 24 pupils and their families who will be affected by this for years to come, but for the 51 members of staff and their families, the sense of community, the skills and experience that will be very difficult to pull together again. It's come at a huge human cost. And if it all does go back to one sentence in a note on my desk, if that is the reason for the closure of the school, then questions must be asked of the regulators and what they've done, because the cost to others has been so disproportionate. It is, in my mind, a national scandal, and a lot of questions must be asked about how high up this goes, because it's clearly been coordinated. It's not just been poor practice or incompetence on the part of the care inspector or Perth and Kinross Council. There's something being very coordinated about the whole thing. One of the reasons that I felt it was important to become part of a larger schools group, and ultimately we chose the Witherslack group, was because nowadays you do need to have a certain professionalism at governor level. You can't just have people who are interested in the school and willing to support the school. You have to have professional expertise. In other words, you have to have external management. And it's something that became very clear to me very soon after I started in January. So it wasn't, my idea of approaching Witherslack wasn't purely financial. It was also just in terms of the structure of the organisation and to develop something that was more robust and sustainable for the future. My relationship with the board, they initially had blamed the poor relationship with Perth and Kinross Council on my predecessor. And I tried to convince them over a period of time that it was not the case, that my predecessor and myself had made every effort possible to develop a far more collaborative relationship with Perth and Kinross. But it wasn't a message that seemed to be sinking in. And by the time it got to May, June time, we were facing closure of the school for financial reasons, or the possible takeover by Witherslack. And so everything that I was doing, I was prioritising around the possibility that Witherslack would take over, and a lot of the issues in terms of governance would disappear. So my relationship with the board remained cordial. They thought I'd done a great job in bringing pupil numbers up, in bringing Witherslack in. Witherslack, as I said before, had insisted that I remain with the school in order for them to take over. And I reluctantly agreed to that. But when things became difficult in October, November, I suddenly sensed that because of the decision I had taken with the staff concern that had been raised, suddenly I'd gone from being Messiah to pariah. And that took place within a matter of hours, I think. And they still, towards the end, were trying to suggest that the school closed because of a mistake that I had made. I was cleared by disciplinary process. Both Angie and myself are very robust in our defence of our actions and feel we did exactly the right thing, and we have been shown to have done the right thing. But it would be convenient for those who wish to do so to suggest that the school closed because of errors at senior management level.
And you are confident that no errors can be demonstrated?
100% confident, yes.
Okay. You talk about communications.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I was reinstated in the school the weekend after, or the Monday after the school had closed. And I was, I think, brought back in to do the rather unpleasant task of closing the school down, issuing redundancy notices, dealing with all of that sort of thing, which had to be done. And I don't feel aggrieved that suddenly that landed on my desk. It was something that you have to do. But I was still under a disciplinary process, so I still had to wait for that to go through in order for my name to be cleared. And the communications with the Board of Governors became more difficult and tense, I would say, because I think that they themselves were becoming confused about what had happened. They realised that the whole story about the school closure was not going to just die. Initially, there had been a lot of press coverage, TV coverage, indicating that there were serious safeguarding child protection concerns. But as more and more information was coming out, more and more questions were being asked. As the parents in particular were coming together and demonstrating that they trusted the school. Rather than turning against the school, what they were saying is, actually, we trust the school ahead of trusting the care inspectorate and ahead of trusting Perth and Kinross Council. And I don't think that they fully expected that. So the board suddenly found themselves in also a vulnerable position where people were starting to ask questions about their own actions. And it's even got to the stage now where elected members of Perth and Kinross Council are contacting me for information about what's been happening because they don't trust their own officials. So within this fog, within this confusion and this misinformation, what people really want is the truth. And when you start asking those difficult questions, you ask questions of the care inspectorate and their professional behaviour. You ask a lot of questions of Perth and Kinross Council about the way they managed the school within the last few days of term and about decisions that were taken prior to that. You ask questions about the Board of Governors, and the answer is I don't know the answer to a lot of those questions. I think the only way we will find out is once we get minutes of meetings from the board meetings to find out exactly who said what. Who was it who decided that the school had to close within 5 days? Was it the Board of Governors? Was it the Care Inspectorate? Was it Education Scotland? Was it Perth and Kinross Council? From where I'm sitting here, I don't have the answer to those questions. And so my communication with the Board of Governors has ceased, and the school itself has ceased operation.